Hey friends and family, thanks for tuning in to tonight's Thursday Night Thought. Tonight's thought comes to you from the beautiful state of Montana. In fact, I'm going to try and turn this tripod around so you can see this view. Sitting here at my parents' house. I don't know if you can see that gorgeous river or not that I'm looking at. This absolutely tranquil location. Give me a moment as I reset this up. I hope that was inspiring for you as well, because as I look out at this view, this message is very much about peace, and so is this location. And so there's so much beauty to this. And I'm going to go ahead and read this week's message to you. And it's this: let go that you might find. Bury the hatchet of the mind. Two trees, one of life, one of death. You had to know. Choices bore consequences, yet to err is human, to forgive divine. Two trees, bury the hatchet of the mind. When this message came across, it came across as an audible message, and so I just wrote down the words that I heard. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not really quite sure of the understanding of this message. So that's something I feel like we're going to discover together as we go deeper into this. But it was very clear there were certain elements of this message and where they came from. So that's what I want to talk about for a moment. So many of you who are following our journey on Facebook know that my family and I are on summer vacation. We're taking the kids to all the different national parks. And we happen to be here in Montana, and we were driving along and we ended up stopping at a place called Custer's Battlefield Museum, which is a museum that holds many of the artifacts in representation of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And it's a wonderful museum, and I wrote a lot about it on my Facebook page if you want to read the story. But there was a spiritual experience I had that I want to share and bring into tonight's message, and that is, on this land, not only was there a very bloody battle that was fought between the natives to this American land, the Indians, and the Americans, and there was this huge battle that ensued, and there was very bloody. And typically when I go to any type of battle site here in the US, you can feel a certain type of reverence when you're on the land where there's been bloodshed. There's a reverence for the people who gave their lives fighting for what it is they believed in. And this is what I've typically feel. But there was a difference in this location, because this was also a location that not only was there bloodshed, but there was a ceremony of burying the hatchet, where the chief of the Sioux Indians and the general of the American Army came together and they buried the hatchet as a representation of peace. And when you stand on this land, it's so beautiful to know that there was bloodshed, there was destruction, but on that same land, there was a treaty of peace by this burying the hatchet. So that was the first part of this message. Let go that you might find. Bury the hatchet of the mind. Okay, so maybe there's a weapon that you've used against yourself of your mind, and it's calling us to bury. It's calling us to bury the hatchet, meaning to create peace. Then it goes on to state, two trees, one of life, one of death. You had to know. Choices bore consequences. So this part of the message is bringing in what I saw is the story of creation. I might stop for a moment while this plane flies overhead. So beautiful out here. Actually, I'm sitting here looking at two trees. So for those of you who know the story of creation in the Bible, there was the Garden of Eden, and there were two trees that were specifically mentioned that were placed in the middle of the garden, and God told Adam and Eve that they could, or actually told Adam that he could eat from any of the trees and that it was good, but there was one tree that he wasn't to eat of, because if he did, he would die. And we all know the story. He ate of the tree. He didn't die physically, but there was a death spiritually, in that when he had this knowledge of good and evil, it caused this feeling of separation from God. In fact, the flesh is what separated us, is what we're told, from God. And when I read this, and I did a little bit of study about this week, and how this applies to burying the hatchet and kind of just tying in this whole message, is that God is representation of both of those trees. God is representation of the tree of life and this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which brought death. So the tree wasn't inherently evil, and the death wasn't bad. It was just the fact that it was an understanding. And quite honestly, when I read a little bit deeper, it felt to me like it was how the choice was made, in the sequence that the choice was made. Because it's a very interesting story where they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and you think, what a vengeful and mean God that they would be kicked out and have this temptation, and it's just kind of an odd story. But the more you look at that story, you say, if they chose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they had this feeling of separation because they were in their flesh, then they felt separate, and God didn't want them to have an eternal life of feeling separate from him. That's what I feel. And so it was actually out of grace that they weren't able to go back into the garden to eat from the tree of life, which would give them an eternal life. It's more of a spiritual life and death. And so the story of the Bible continues, and I believe that Jesus is the life, is the bridge to this relationship with God. And that's given to everyone as a choice to believe that or not. But for me, it was this representation of, what if they had chosen life first and then experienced death, experienced the knowledge of good and evil. I think it's a sequence issue of those two trees, but you had to know. And through that knowledge, choices bore consequences. And maybe there's something in your life where you've experienced that, where you had to know something. It wasn't just someone was going to tell you what was good and what was bad, or what was right or what was wrong. You had to know yourself. And those choices bore consequences. Yet, to err is human, to forgive divine. That gift of spiritual life, of love, compassion, forgiveness, of all of those things we experience on a spiritual level when we believe and think of God. At least that's what my belief is. And then this idea of that's what made us human. And divine, when we accept that there were two parts to God. Death in one respect, and life. And we're the ones who have to make that choice to bury the hatchet, if in any way that continues to be a weapon to make peace between those two aspects that live within us. Very powerful message, very deep message, but very peaceful message. And I just wanted to share it with you and share that information that had come through to me. So if anyone is experiencing not having peace of mind, that can only come from realizing that we all in every moment have a choice of dying to feeling like we're apart from God and knowing that God is a part of all creation. And it's our mind that's the battlefield. And that brings peace. So thank you for allowing me to share. And I look forward to sharing our next Thursday night thought together.